Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Today we are going to discuss the motor and sensory areas on the superolateral surface of the brain. So, as we know, the cerebral cortex has 6 layers in the histological structure. Broadman, he is a German neuroscientist, has classified the cerebral cortex into different areas according to the function of each. And the Broadman classification is a worldwide classification of cerebral cortex functional areas from area 1 to area 49. And here we are the discussion of the motor and sensory areas on the we will discuss on the lateral surface, and then we are going to the medial surface and inferior surface of the brain. So as you know, the cerebral cortex on the lateral surface, here is the lateral surface of the brain, and this is the lateral fissure, and this is the central sulcus. Here another sulcus, the precentral sulcus, and in the parietal lobe the postcentral sulcus. The motor cortex, here's the imaginary line. This is the parieto-occipital fissure, and this is the first imaginary line, and this is the second imaginary line, as we discussed before. So the cerebral cortex on the lateral surface is divided into frontal cortex, parietal, this is frontal, parietal cortex behind the central sulcus, and the occipital cortex, and below the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, the temporal lobe, which includes the temporal cortex. So we will start with this area, which is called Precentral Gyrus, here between the central and precentral sulcus in the frontal lobe. This area is called motor area 4. As you know, motor area 4 is localized between the central and precentral sulci of the frontal lobe. This area includes the pyramidal tract origin area, as the pyramidal cells, which are located in the layer 5 of the cerebral cortex. This is the origin of the pyramidal tract, which is the motor area 4. And if we the stimulation of this area cause localized movement on the opposite side of the body, especially on the hands and feet. Also with increased muscle tone against gravity. You should also know this area here, the body is represented upside down. So here is the lowermost part of this area, representing the area of the face, while the lower limb here are representing on the uppermost area of this area 4, and here should be the trunk and the upper limb. Also, we should know that the lower limb area here on the uppermost part of motor area 4 also represented on the medial side of the frontal cortex and the paracentral lobule, as we discussed in the lab session and also in the first lecture of our course. The lesion of this area is upper motor neuron lesion type, of course, because this is the lesion of the cerebral cortex. And the phenomena or the lesion which is caused by injury of this area is called contralateral hemiplegia or hemiparesis, according to the extent of the lesion. The lesion will be most manifested on the upper and lower limbs. because this area function is to control fine skilled motor movement, especially hands and feet. Okay, this is about motor area 4. What about this area here, just in front of motor area 4? This area is called premotor area 6. So we have area 4 and just in front premotor area 6. So the premotor area 6, or it's called extrapyramidal area, the stimulation of this area causes generalized movements on the opposite side of the body with decrease of muscle tone. This area is also called psychomotor area. What about the lesion of this area? If we have a lesion in this area, because this area function is just to stimulate groups of muscles, so it acts on a large group of muscle nuclei, like the corpus striatum, red nucleus, cranial motor nerve nuclei, reticular formation inside the brainstem, olivary nuclei, and also spinal nuclei and their tracts. A condition which makes the stimulation of this area leads to generalized voluntary movement. Generalized voluntary movements of the opposite side of the body, of course, with the stimulation of muscle tone. This area has inhibitory influence of the lower centers, which we discussed, like the spinal nuclei or the reticular formation or olivary nuclei. And moreover, it has also a role in production of automatic movements during the voluntary movements. Automatic movements of arms during walking and these associated movements. The lesion of this area causes loss of these productions and association of automatic voluntary movements, and also hypertonia and rigidity are obvious during movements. Also maybe appearance of involuntary movements as tremors, and a condition known as apraxia, which is inability to produce voluntary movement in spite of no lesion or no paralysis of these movements. As you know, the frontal cortex in front of the precentral sulcus is divided into two parts by means of these two sulci. The upper sulcus is the superior and the lower sulcus is the inferior frontal sulci. In the middle frontal gyrus here, another area is very important in controlling both eye movements, which is called area 8. This is called frontal eye field area. Frontal eye field area in the middle part of the middle frontal gyrus, if stimulated, it causes conjugate movements or conjugate deviation of two eyes together to the opposite side, as it follows the object from moving from right to left side or in the opposite direction. So the two eyes are moving together. Sure, this area is connected to the superior colliculus, which is a higher center for the vision. And if this area lesioned, it causes movements of both eyes to the same side of lesion, because the right area, for example, the right frontal eye field area, is responsible for conjugate movement of both eyes to the left side. So if a lesion happened in the right frontal eye field area 8, both eyes will go to the same side of lesion, so both eyes will go to the right side, not to the left side, by the action of the intact visual eye field area or frontal eye field area, which is in the left side. Okay, so the inferior frontal gyrus, here we have another area which is very important. This called area 44 and 45. This area is called Broca's area of speech. It just lies in front of the face area and the motor area and the precentral gyrus. Its stimulation causes vocalization, so it's responsible for coordination of different muscles that produce fluent speech. The patient here understands what he wants to say, but he is unable to translate his feelings into mechanical movements of normal speech. So the speaking is intact, the speaking apparatus is intact, no paralysis, but he couldn't coordinate different movement of muscles to produce fluent speech. And you should know also that this area is very important on the left side. So its Broca's area is present on the left hemisphere of the right-handed people. This is the dominant cerebral hemisphere or the leading hemisphere in most of population. Also, you should know that this area is connected to another area here in the posterior parietal lobe. We will discuss in few minutes by this fasciculus, which is called Arcuate Fasciculus. And this area here is area 39 and 40 and area 22. This area is called Vernix area, as we will discuss. The lesion of this area, Broca's area, produce a phenomena called non-fluent aphasia or motor aphasia. Contrary to the area of Vernix, this is the area of Vernix area, in which the patient has fluent aphasia or sensory aphasia or receptive aphasia. And this is Broca. Here, if paralyzed or if involvement of middle cerebral artery, it will cause non-fluent aphasia or motor aphasia or expressive aphasia. This is what you should know about Broca's area. And now we will shift to the parietal lobe and discuss the areas or the different areas on the cerebral cortex on the parietal lobe. So the first gyrus to be identified on the parietal lobe is this gyrus, which is the post-central gyrus. This is the post-central gyrus between the central and the post-central sulci. What about this post-central gyrus? Here, another very important area which is called area 312. Area 312. The post-central or sensory area 312 is the primary somatic area of the body, or the primary somatosensory area of the body. Also, the body is represented upside down, as in the representation of the motor area. So, the face area is lying on the lowermost part, and the lower limb area on the uppermost part of this area, also extending on the paracentral lobule around the central sulcus on the medial surface, and here the arms and trunk area. Also, the body is represented contralaterally, so the right area representing the left side of the body and vice versa. This area 312 just receiving sensation or sensory stimuli from the spinal cord or from the lower centers, and of course the stimulus ascend in the spinal cord, and the ascending tracts are going from the sensory root of the spinal cord to reach the thalamus, and in the thalamus it's going to posterolateral ventral nucleus of the thalamus, and then from this nucleus the superior thalamic radiation or the sensory radiations are going to this area on the opposite side, of course. The lesion of this area produces contralateral hemianesthesia. This means that the opposite side of the body lose to discriminate between different or to loses the sensation. So if you stimulate the upper or the lower limb, for example, by different sensory modalities, this patient will not feel the stimulus because this area is lesioned in the cerebral cortex. What about the rest of the parietal lobule? Here we have intraparietal fissure or intraparietal sulcus, which divides the rest of the parietal lobule into superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. And this area here, in the posterior part of the parietal lobule, is called somatosensory association area. The function of this area is to coordinate different modalities of sensation to understand them. So, for example, if you give a patient or a normal subject, if you give a normal subject a pen, for example, and put in his right hand and ask this person to identify blindly without opening his eye what is in his right hand, of course he will tell that this is a pen or a book or whatever you give. And if this area has a lesion, so he has a condition called agnosia or astereognosis, so he couldn't identify what is kept in his right hand without seeing it. This is called astereognosis because he couldn't coordinate different sensory modalities, of course because of the lesion of this area in the parietal association area. Okay, in the inferior part or in the inferior parietal lobule, around the posterior end, as we said here, in the inferior parietal lobule we have the vernix area. So the vernix area is divided into three different areas. Before we discuss the vernix area, we should draw here the superior and the inferior frontal temporal sulci, which are in the temporal lobe. So here in the middle of the superior temporal gyrus, we have another area called 41 and 42. This area is the primary auditory area, 41, 42. Okay, so this area is responsible for perceiving auditory stimuli from the opposite side of the ear. So in case of the lesion of area 41 and 42, you have a contralateral diminution of hearing acuity, not contralateral deafness, as we said, because this area is representing on both cerebral cortex. So if one area is lesioned, hopefully the other area will compensate for the hearing on the opposite side, so you have a hearing acuity diminution, not a hearing loss. And also around this area in the superior temporal gyrus. Here, this area is called auditory association area. The auditory association area is responsible for understanding the meaning of the auditory stimuli, which is perceived by the primary auditory area. So if this area is lesioned, we have a condition called auditory agnosia. So the patient cannot discriminate between auditory stimuli or cannot understand what he is hearing. Sometimes it's called auditory aphasia. Okay, so the posterior end of this area is called area 22. The posterior end of this area in the superior temporal gyrus, and also this gyrus here, which is called supramarginal gyrus. This gyrus lies in the inferior parietal lobule. And the gyrus just below this gyrus, which is the angular gyrus around the posterior end of a superior temporal sulcus. So these three areas collectively are known as Vernix area, as we discussed before. So the Vernix area is composed of three different areas. One is supramarginal. This is the supramarginal gyrus, which lies around the posterior end of the lateral fissure, or the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure. And the other one is angular gyrus, which lies around the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus. And also, don't forget the posterior end of area 22. These three areas collectively are known as Vernix area. The function of Vernix area is to understand both written and spoken words. And the lesion of this area produce a phenomena called receptive aphasia or sensory aphasia or fluent aphasia. We call it fluent because the patient can talk fluently, very fluently, but his talk makes no sense and you cannot understand him, and he is not aware of his problem. As we mentioned, there is a link between Broca's area, which is the inferior frontal gyrus, and Vernix area. This link is very important in speech production, and it's called Arcuate Fasciculus. So it is a form of the association fibers inside the cerebral hemisphere. The rest of the lateral cortex, or the lateral cortex on the cerebral hemisphere, which is the rest of the temporal lobe here and the occipital lobes. So the occipital lobe here, the main area is on the medial side, as we will see when we'll discuss the medial surface of the cerebral cortex, and it's concerned with identification of visual stimuli with the whole occipital cortex. And the temporal lobe, the rest of the temporal lobe, is concerned with memory, especially short-term and recent memory. This is all about the lateral cerebral cortex, and in the next video we will describe the cerebral cortex on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere and the functional areas which are represented on the medial side. Thank you very much.